The morning of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea, a B-25, Mitchell bomber, designated Chatterbox, skimmed 15 feet above the Pacific, its twin Wright engines screaming at full throttle. In the nose, where there should have been Plexiglas and a bombardier's station, 8 50-caliber machine guns protruded like the fangs of some mechanical predator. Behind the yoke, Captain Robert Chatt held the bomber steady, racing toward the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki at 300 miles per hour. The destroyer's deck guns tracked desperately toward him, their crews realizing too late that this was no ordinary Mitchell. This bomber wasn't climbing to altitude to drop its payload from safety. It was coming straight at them, and it was armed like a fighter aircraft that had somehow swallowed a bomber's soul. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Chat's fingers found the trigger. All 8 guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise inside the cockpit was beyond deafening, a physical force that rattled teeth and compressed lungs. 50-caliber rounds, each one half an inch of copper-jacketed lead moving at 2,900 feet per second, poured toward the destroyer at a combined rate of 6,400 rounds per minute. The Japanese sailors on deck didn't take cover, they simply ceased to exist. Gun emplacements disintegrated. The bridge windows exploded into glittering clouds. Steel plating buckled and tore. At 200 feet from impact, Chatt released a 500-pound bomb with a delayed fuse. The weapon skipped across the waves like a stone thrown by an angry god, slammed into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline, and punched through 18 inches of steel before the fuse triggered. The Shirayuki lurched violently to port, out of control, smoke already pouring from her ruptured engine room. She careened, directly into the path of the transport ship Nojima. The collision was catastrophic. Both vessels went down within minutes, taking nearly 2,000 Japanese soldiers to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea before they could fire a single shot in defense of their positions in New Guinea. Chatt pulled up hard, clearing the destroyer's mast by perhaps 10 feet, and banked away as the ocean behind him erupted in flames and debris. His co-pilot was screaming something, probably prayers or profanity or both. It didn't matter, they'd done the impossible. A medium bomber had just killed a destroyer in a knife fight. By nightfall on March 5th, every single Japanese transport in that 16-ship convoy had been destroyed. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, gone. Of the 6,900 troops Japan desperately needed to reinforce their crumbling position in New Guinea, fewer than 1,200 reached Lae. The rest drowned or died under the guns of aircraft that shouldn't have been able to do what they did. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over, and with it died Japan's last realistic chance to regain the initiative in the Southwest Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur would later call it the decisive aerial engagement of the war in that theatre. But MacArthur didn't mention the detail that made it possible, the detail that turned that battle from a desperate gamble into a massacre. Those B-25 Mitchells weren't supposed to have 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Those modifications weren't in any manual, hadn't been approved by any procurement officer, and violated approximately 17 different Army Air Forces regulations regarding aircraft alterations. The man who'd built those commerce destroyers, as they came to be called, had done it without permission, using weapons scavenged from wrecked fighters, working in maintenance hangars after official duty hours, telling officers who objected to mind their own business and let him save lives. His name was Paul Irving Gunn, though everyone called him Pappy because at 43 years old he was ancient by the standards of men who typically died in their 20s. He wasn't an engineer, wasn't a designer. He'd learned to work on aircraft as a Navy enlisted mechanic in the 1920s, then spent 2 decades flying cargo and passengers for airlines in Hawaii and the Philippines. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he'd been running a small airline operation in Manila with a handful of Red Beechcraft Model 18 transports. He should have evacuated. He should have run to Australia with the other American civilians while there was still time. Instead, he'd volunteered to fly medical supplies into Bataan, while the battered American and Filipino forces made their last stand, piloting unarmed civilian aircraft through airspace controlled by Japanese Zeros, landing on cratered airstrips under artillery fire, delivering morphine and plasma to men whose screams could be heard from the runway. The Army Air Forces commissioned him as a captain on the spot, not because they particularly wanted a 42-year-old former Navy mechanic turned airline pilot, but because Paul Gunn simply refused to stop doing what needed to be done, and somebody had to make it official. When Bataan fell in April 1942, Gunn's wife Polly and their 4 children were in Manila. The Japanese interned them at the University of Santo Tomas, where they would spend the next 3 years as prisoners, eating rice contaminated with worms and sleeping on concrete floors and losing weight until their bones showed through their skin. Gunn escaped to Australia. He could have requested evacuation back to the United States on compassionate grounds, family imprisoned, combat fatigue, age, take your pick. Instead, he requested assignment to any unit that would let him kill Japanese. What he got was exactly what he needed, a commander who understood that winning wars sometimes required ignoring regulations. General George Kenny arrived in Australia in the summer of 1942 to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. He inherited a disaster. The 5th Air Force had aircraft, plenty of them, but they couldn't accomplish their primary mission, stopping Japanese convoys from reinforcing their garrisons in New Guinea. The heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing. They could drop tons of ordnance on enemy airfields and installations with devastating effect. But ships moved. From 15,000 feet, a bombardier watched his bombs fall for nearly 30 seconds before impact. A transport ship steaming at 15 knots could cover 200 yards in that time. The bombs splashed harmlessly into empty ocean while the transport sailed on, delivering troops and supplies that would kill Allied soldiers. The medium bombers, A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells, could fly lower, but lower meant exposure to anti-aircraft fire, and they lacked the defensive armament to suppress ship-mounted guns. An A-20 approaching a destroyer at 3,000 feet faced massed 25mm and 40mm fire that would shred aluminum skin and kill crews before they could release their bombs. The few bombers that survived the approach often scored no hits. Their nose armament, typically 4.30 caliber machine guns for the A-20, couldn't silence the Japanese gun crews. Those 30 caliber weapons were designed for defense against fighters, not for suppressing surface targets. They made a lot of noise and accomplished very little. Japanese convoys sailed with impunity, and Allied forces in New Guinea fought undermanned and undersupplied because nobody could figure out how to sink ships with aircraft effectively. Then Kenny arrived in Brisbane and started asking questions. He toured the maintenance facilities, talked to ground crews, inspected aircraft. At one of the 3rd Bombardment Group's hangars, he found something that wasn't supposed to exist, an A-20 Havoc with the plexiglass nose removed. In its place, someone had installed a solid metal nose section containing 450 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, the weapons scavenged from wrecked P-40 Warhawk fighters. The installation was crude, welded and bolted in place with obvious field modifications. It looked like something a mechanic would build in his garage, not something that would come from Douglas Aircraft's engineering department. It looked, in other words, like it had been designed by someone who understood that aircraft are just machines, and machines can be changed if you have enough nerve and the right tools. Kenny asked who'd done the modification. The answer came from a captain with grease under his fingernails and a look in his eyes that suggested he'd stopped caring about regulations approximately 3 wars ago. Pappy Gunn introduced himself and explained his reasoning with the blunt directness of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and therefore had nothing left to fear from career consequences. The A-20's defensive armament was useless for attacking ships. Japanese gun crews would tear apart any bomber approaching at medium altitude. But if an A-20 came in at masthead height, below the angle of depression of most ship-mounted weapons, it could strafe the deck and suppress the gunners before they could effectively return fire. Once the deck was cleared, the bomber could release its payload from minimum altitude. From 200 feet, hitting a ship wasn't a matter of complex calculation. It was point and shoot. The 50 caliber guns would make it possible. They'd give the bomber enough firepower to kill Japanese sailors before those sailors could kill the bomber crew. Kenny listened to this explanation, delivered in an Arkansas drawl thick enough to cut with a propeller blade. Then he asked the question that mattered. "Does it work?" Gunn said he hadn't tested it in combat yet, because technically he'd exceeded his authority by modifying an aircraft without formal approval, and if it didn't work, he'd probably be court-martialed for destroying government property. Kenny, to his credit, didn't care about regulations. He cared about results. He promoted Gunn to major, assigned him to his personal staff as special projects officer, and gave him 3 words that amounted to a blank check: keep doing it. The formal order came down 2 days later. Major Gunn would modify 16 additional A-22s with forward-firing 50 caliber armament. He'd also install external bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs, weapons that would be devastating against Japanese airfields when delivered at low altitude. The modifications would be completed as quickly as possible. The first test of Gunn's commerce destroyers came on September 12, 1942, when modified A-22s from the 3rd Attack Group struck the Japanese airfield at Buna on the northern coast of Papua. The attack was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. The Havocs came in at treetop level, their 50 calibers shredding parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and any personnel who had the misfortune of being visible. Then came the parafrag bombs, small 23-pound fragmentation weapons that deployed parachutes to slow their descent, allowing the bombers to escape before detonation. The bombs scattered over the airfield like deadly seeds, their explosions sending shrapnel through thin-skinned aircraft and unprotected infantry. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese had lost 34 aircraft destroyed on the ground, fuel stores burning, and their anti-aircraft positions silent, because Gunn's guns had killed the crews before they could train their weapons on the attackers. It was exactly the result Kenny had hoped for, but it raised an obvious question. If this works on the A-20, what about the B-25? The Mitchell was a larger aircraft, with longer range and greater payload capacity. It was also less maneuverable, which made some pilots skeptical that it could be used for low-level strafing attacks. The bombing tables said medium bombers operated at 8 to 12,000 feet for a reason. Taking a B-25 down to masthead height violated every doctrine manual the Army Air Forces had published. But Pappy Gunn didn't read doctrine manuals. He read blueprints, and the B-25's blueprints showed him that the bomber's nose section was essentially modular. Remove the plexiglas and the bombardier's station, install a reinforced metal nose cap, and you had space for guns. A lot of guns. He started with 4 50 calibers, the same configuration as his modified A-22s. The installation was straightforward. The weapons came from wrecked fighters, P-40s, and P-39s that had brought their pilots home but wouldn't be rebuilt. Gunn pulled the guns from the wrecks, cleaned them, test-fired them, and installed them in the Mitchell's nose with charging handles accessible to the pilot. The ammunition bays fed from containers in the forward fuselage. 4 guns gave the bomber firepower equivalent to a fighter aircraft. But Gunn was already thinking about what happens when 4 guns isn't enough. What happens when you're strafing a destroyer and the crew has time to man their anti-aircraft positions before you finish your run? What happens when there are 2 ships and you need to suppress gunners on both simultaneously? The answer was more guns. By October 1942, Gunn was installing 8 50 caliber weapons in B-25 nose sections. 8 guns firing simultaneously delivered 6,400 rounds per minute in a cone of destruction that could saw through steel plate, punch holes in engine blocks, and kill every living thing on a ship's deck in the time it took to fly past. The modifications didn't stop at guns. Gunn redesigned the ammunition feed systems to prevent jams during violent maneuvering. He reinforced the nose mounting points because the recoil from 8 50 calibers firing simultaneously could crack airframe components. He added sights calibrated for low-altitude strafing. He installed pilot-accessible controls for all weapons because in a masthead attack there was no time for a gunner to make targeting decisions. Everything had to happen at the speed of the pilot's reflexes. The work was done in maintenance hangars across northern Australia and New Guinea. Gunn moved between facilities like a man possessed, supervising installations, training mechanics, solving problems nobody had anticipated because nobody had tried this before. He worked 18-hour days, slept in his clothes when he slept at all, and maintained a stream of increasingly creative profanity directed at supply officers who questioned why he needed so many spare fighter guns and so much .50 caliber ammunition for bombers. One supply officer in Brisbane apparently made the mistake of denying guns requisition forms. The exact details are lost to history, but the legend involves Gunn pulling a pistol, not necessarily pointing it at anyone but making it visible, and explaining that the guns and ammunition were going to be loaded on his truck in the next 15 minutes, or the supply officer could explain to General Kenny why combat units weren't receiving critical materials. The guns and ammunition were loaded on the truck. Gunn was reportedly banned from the Brisbane supply depot for several months, which probably saved that supply officer's life. By December 1942, Gunn had modified enough B-25 seconds to equip an entire squadron. The 90th Bombardment Squadron, part of the 3rd Bomb Group, received the first commerce destroyers and began training under their new commander, Major Ed Larner. Larner was a pilot who understood that innovation meant accepting risk. He took the modified Mitchells down to masthead height over Port Moresby and Harbour and practiced strafing runs on a wrecked freighter sitting on the reef. He perfected the attack profile: approach at high speed, no higher than 200 feet, open fire at 600 yards, walk the rounds into the target, release bombs at minimum distance, and pull up hard to clear the superstructure. The practice runs revealed problems Gunn hadn't anticipated. The recoil from 8 guns created enough vibration to affect accuracy. The solution was improved mounting hardware and reinforced nose structures. The gun blast created turbulence that made targeting difficult. The solution was adjusting the gun's mounting angles to create a tighter pattern. The pilots reported that the nose-heavy configuration affected handling. The solution was ballast adjustments and revised loading procedures. Every problem had a solution, and every solution was implemented without waiting for approval from engineers at North American Aviation. The factory that built the B-25 was located in Kansas, thousands of miles away. Gunn was in New Guinea, where Japanese convoys were supplying enemy garrisons every week. He didn't have time to send technical drawings to Kansas and wait for engineering reviews. He had mechanics, wrenches, and aircraft that needed to be modified before the next convoy sailed. That would have to be enough. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In January 1943, intelligence intercepts revealed that Japan was preparing another major convoy to reinforce Leh. The codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had decrypted Japanese naval messages, indicating that 8 transports escorted by 8 destroyers would attempt the run from Rabaul across the Bismarck Sea in early March. Nearly 7,000 troops, desperately needed to shore up Japan's crumbling position in New Guinea, would be aboard those transports. If they reached Leh, the campaign for New Guinea would become exponentially more difficult and costly in Allied lives. General Kenny knew this was the moment to test whether Pappy Gunn's modifications would work not just against airfields and isolated vessels, but against a heavily defended convoy with destroyer escorts and fighter cover. He assembled a strike force that represented every innovation his air forces had developed. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds for high-altitude bombing to scatter the convoy, Australian Beaufighters to suppress anti-aircraft fire, and the commerce destroyers, and the modified B-25 seconds and A-20 seconds that would deliver the killing blows with skip bombing and devastating strafing runs. The pilots trained relentlessly throughout February. They practiced skip bombing, a technique borrowed from the British where bombs released at minimum altitude would skip across the water like flat stones and slam into the sides of ships. The technique required precise timing and iron nerves. Release too early and the bomb skipped past the target. Release too late and you flew into your own explosion. Combined with Gunn's forward-firing guns, skip bombing transformed the B-25 from a medium bomber into something that had never existed before, an aircraft that could suppress a ship's defenses while simultaneously delivering ordnance that could sink it. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul just after midnight on February 28, 1943. Allied reconnaissance spotted them on March 1st, and shadowing aircraft tracked their progress throughout the night. By the morning of March 3rd, the convoy had rounded the Huon Peninsula and entered the Bismarck Sea proper, placing them within range of the full Allied strike force. The weather, which had been miserable with heavy rain and low clouds, suddenly cleared. The Japanese Commodore, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, must have realized in that moment that his convoy was doomed. Clear skies meant Allied aircraft could find them and attack in coordinated waves. But there was no turning back. The troops aboard those transports were committed. The first wave struck mid-morning. B-17 seconds from the 43rd Bomb Group attacked from 12,000 feet. Their bombs scattered across the convoy to force the ships to break formation and evade. The Japanese destroyers responded with intensive anti-aircraft fire, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. Several bombs found their marks. The transport Kyokusei Maru took a direct hit and began listing badly. Her escorts closed in to rescue survivors, pulling soldiers from the oil-slicked water while maintaining their anti-aircraft barrage. The convoy scattered as Kenny had intended, individual ships maneuvering desperately to avoid the high-altitude bombers. This was exactly what the commerce destroyers needed. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the second wave arrived. Australian Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron came in first, flying so low their propellers nearly touched the wave tops. Their 4 20mm cannons and 6 30-caliber machine guns raked the decks of the transports and destroyers, killing gun crews and forcing sailors to take cover. Right behind them came the commerce destroyers. Major Ed Lana led the 90th Bomb Squadron's B-25 seconds in line astern formation, 12 aircraft loaded with 500-pound bombs, and enough 50-caliber ammunition to fire continuously for 2 minutes. Lana selected his target, the transport Teiyo Maru, and began his attack run. From the destroyer Shirayuki, Japanese gunners watched the Mitchell boring in at wavetop height and understood too late what they were facing. This wasn't a conventional bomber that would climb to altitude and release its payload from a position of relative safety. This was something new, something that shouldn't exist according to every naval warfare doctrine the Imperial Japanese Navy had studied. The B-25 came straight at them, growing larger with terrifying speed, and then its nose erupted in flame. 8 50-caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The Japanese had fought American aircraft for over a year. They knew what machine gun fire looked like, the tracer rounds that marked every fifth bullet creating visible lines through the air. But they'd never seen this. This was a river of fire, a continuous stream of destruction so dense it appeared solid. Each gun cycled at 800 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,400 rounds per minute, more than 100 bullets every second, each one capable of punching through a quarter-inch of steel plate. The rounds walked across the Teiyo Maru's deck like a scythe through wheat. Sailors attempting to man their anti-aircraft positions simply disappeared, torn apart by impacts that arrived faster than human reaction time. Gun mounts disintegrated, the bridge windows shattered, ventilation shafts and railings and anything else protruding from the deck surface were shredded into fragments. The transport's return fire was pitiful, sporadic, inaccurate. Most of her gun crews were dead before they could train their weapons on the attacking bomber. At 200 yards, Lana released his bomb. The 500-pound weapon hit the water, skipped once, twice, and slammed into the transport's hull just above the waterline. The delayed fuse gave Lana 3 seconds to clear the target area. He pulled up hard, clearing the transport's superstructure, and banked away as the bomb detonated deep inside the ship's engine room. The Teiyo Maru's back broke. She began settling immediately. Her hull ruptured below the waterline, seawater flooding her lower decks faster than the pumps could compensate. 11 more B-25 seconds followed Lana through the gauntlet, each selecting targets, each strafing and skip-bombing with mechanical precision. The transport Nojima took a bomb amidships that detonated in her cargo hold. The explosion was catastrophic. She'd been carrying ammunition and fuel drums. When the bomb cooked off her cargo, the entire ship lifted out of the water and came apart in mid-air. her hull plates peeling back like the petals of some obscene steel flower. There were no survivors. The destroyer Shirayuki attempted to engage the commerce destroyers with her main guns, swinging her 5-inch weapons toward the approaching Mitchells. It was futile. Her guns were designed for surface warfare and anti-aircraft work at altitude, not for tracking targets that appeared from over the horizon at 300 miles per hour and barely 20 feet off the water. Before her gun crews could adjust their aim, Captain Robert Chatt's B-25, Chatterbox, was on top of them. Chatt's 8 guns shredded the destroyer's deck. His skip bomb punched through her hull. The Shirayuki veered wildly to port, out of control, and collided with the transport Nojima's burning wreckage. Both vessels sank within minutes. The carnage continued for 15 minutes, that must have seemed like 15 hours to the Japanese sailors trapped on those ships. The A-20 Havocs from the 89th Bomb Squadron arrived next, adding their firepower to the chaos. More B-25s made medium-altitude bombing runs, their crews claiming hits on transports that were already listing and burning. Australian Beaufighters made repeated strafing passes, their cannons punching holes in anything still afloat. By 10:15 in the morning, every transport in the convoy had been hit. 3 were sinking fast. 4 more were dead in the water, burning fiercely, their crews abandoning ship. The destroyer escorts, designed to protect their charges, could do nothing but watch as American and Australian aircraft systematically destroyed the convoy they were supposed to defend. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The remaining Japanese ships attempted to limp toward the New Guinea coast, hoping to beach themselves and offload whatever troops had survived. The 5th Air Force didn't give them the chance. Throughout March 3rd and 4th, wave after wave of aircraft struck the survivors. B-25s, A-20s, Beaufighters, even B-17s made low-level strafing runs against ships that could no longer maneuver or defend themselves effectively. PT boats from the U.S. Navy joined the attack, their torpedoes finishing off damaged vessels and machine-gunning lifeboats in acts that would later generate controversy, but which seemed necessary at the time to prevent any reinforcements from reaching Japanese positions. By the morning of March 5, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. All 8 Japanese transports had been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyer escorts were gone. Of the 6,900 troops Japan had attempted to ship to Leh, fewer than 1,200 reached their destination, most of them pulled from the water by submarines operating at night after the air attacks had ceased. The rest drowned or died under the guns of Allied aircraft. Japan lost approximately 3,000 soldiers killed, thousands more who would never fight because they were wounded or traumatized beyond usefulness, and the ships needed to transport them. The Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons by surface convoy was effectively destroyed in 3 days of sustained air attack. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical victory. It was proof of concept for an entirely new form of aerial warfare. Before Bismarck Sea, conventional wisdom held that aircraft could harass shipping, but couldn't decisively defeat a well-defended convoy without taking prohibitive losses. After Bismarck Sea, that wisdom was obsolete. Properly modified aircraft, using innovative tactics, could annihilate surface vessels with devastating efficiency. The cost? 13 Allied airmen killed, 12 wounded, and 4 aircraft shot down out of more than 100 that participated in the battle. Those were acceptable losses for a victory that fundamentally altered the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific. The architects of that victory received varying degrees of recognition. General George Kenney wrote extensively about the battle in his memoirs and received appropriate credit for authorizing the tactical innovations that made it possible. Major Ed Larner, who led the first commerce destroyer attack, became a hero to his squadron. He wouldn't remain their leader for long. His aggressive flying style, the same fearlessness that made him deadly against Japanese shipping, killed him on April 30th when he attempted a low-altitude aerobatic maneuver in an overloaded B-25 at Dobodura airfield. The aircraft stalled, spun, and crashed, killing everyone aboard. Pappy Gunn received a Silver Star for his contributions to the battle, though the citation was deliberately vague about exactly what those contributions entailed. The official records mentioned innovative tactical modifications to aircraft, without specifying that those modifications had been implemented without formal approval from North American Aviation or Army Air Forces headquarters. The truth was that Gunn's commerce destroyers had won the battle, but acknowledging that truth would have required admitting that a former airline pilot with no formal engineering education had redesigned military aircraft in violation of regulations, and those unauthorized modifications had proven more effective than anything the official military-industrial complex had produced. That admission wasn't going to appear in any official Army Air Forces documents. Instead, North American Aviation quietly began incorporating variations of Gunn's modifications into factory production of later B-25 models. The B-25G variant, which entered production in mid-1943, featured a solid nose with 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns and a 75mm cannon, essentially an official version of what Gunn had been building in field hangars for months. The B-25H that followed carried even more forward-firing armament. The final production variant, the B-25J, could be configured with either a glazed bombardier nose for conventional bombing or a solid strafer nose with 8 forward-firing 50 calibers. That final configuration, the 8-gun strafer version of the B-25J, was exactly what Gunn had built in his maintenance hangar in late 1942, except now it had proper engineering drawings and official part numbers, and came with a manual that explained maintenance procedures. North American Aviation's engineers received credit for the design. Their names appeared on the patents. Gunn's name appeared nowhere in the official documentation, which was probably fine with him. He wasn't interested in credit. He was interested in killing Japanese. Throughout 1943 and 44, Gunn flew combat missions in addition to his duties modifying aircraft. He accumulated an impressive combat record: 2 distinguished flying crosses, a Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts for wounds received in action. 9 Purple Hearts. Most servicemen who accumulated that many Purple Hearts either died or were medically evacuated. Gunn kept flying and kept modifying aircraft and kept finding new ways to make bombers more lethal. He experimented with rocket installations, additional gun positions, modified fuel systems to extend range. Every modification was tested in combat, refined based on battlefield results, and implemented across entire squadrons without waiting for official approval. In late 1944, during the liberation of the Philippines, Gunn was at Leyte when a Japanese bombing raid struck the airfield. He was wounded seriously enough that he was finally removed from combat operations. By that point, he'd been fighting continuously for nearly 3 years, had lost significant weight, and looked 20 years older than his actual age. The Army Air Forces promoted him to full colonel and assigned him to stateside duties overseeing B-25 production at North American Aviation's factory in Kansas. It was the right assignment. Gunn could ensure that the modifications he'd pioneered in field conditions were properly incorporated into factory production. But it also meant he was in Kansas while his family was still imprisoned at Santo Tomas in Manila. The liberation of Manila in February 1945 finally freed Polly Gunn and her children. They'd survived 3 years of internment, but barely. Polly's weight had dropped to 80 pounds. The children showed signs of malnutrition and disease. They were among the lucky ones. Many internees at Santo Tomas died before liberation or were executed by Japanese guards in the final days before American forces arrived. Gunn reunited with his family at a hospital in Manila. The historical record doesn't contain detailed accounts of that reunion, but it's not difficult to imagine what it must have been like for a man who'd spent 3 years fighting a war fueled by rage and grief, to finally hold his family again and realize they'd survived. Paul Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces on June 30th, 1948, with the rank of colonel and a medical discharge due to disabilities incurred in service. He returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines, the carrier he'd been operating when the war started. The airline expanded throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, providing service across the South Pacific. Gunn flew regularly, piloting charter flights and maintaining his skills. On October 11, 1957, he was flying a Beechcraft Model 18 similar to the ones he'd operated before the war when he encountered a severe storm over the Philippines. The aircraft crashed. There were no survivors. Gunn was 57 years old. His obituary in American newspapers mentioned that he'd served in World War II and had operated an airline in the Philippines. It didn't mention the commerce destroyers or the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, or the fact that his unauthorized modifications had fundamentally changed aerial warfare in the Pacific. Those details were recorded in Air Force historical documents, but weren't widely known to the public. For decades, Gunn's story remained obscure, known primarily to aviation historians and veterans who'd served in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The official credit for developing the Strafer version of the B-25 went to North American Aviation's engineering department. Their technical documentation described the design process, the structural analysis, the armament configuration. It read like the innovations had emerged from careful engineering study and methodical testing. The documentation didn't mention that a former Navy enlisted mechanic had built the first prototypes using scavenged weapons in violation of regulations, or that those prototypes had been used in combat before any official approval had been granted. That reality didn't fit the narrative of how military technology development was supposed to work. The actual development process, the messy reality of field modifications implemented by mechanics who understood that waiting for official approval meant men would die unnecessarily, that process was sanitized out of the official histories. What remained was a clean story. Engineers designed improved aircraft, the military tested and approved those designs, and the improved aircraft won battles. It was a comforting narrative that reinforced the idea that military institutions functioned efficiently and that innovation flowed downward from command authority. It was also mostly fiction. The truth was that innovation in World War II often came from the bottom up, from enlisted, mechanics and junior officers who saw problems that senior leadership either couldn't see or couldn't acknowledge. Pappy Gunn saw that medium bombers armed with light defensive weapons couldn't effectively attack shipping. The official solution would have been to requisition new aircraft types, wait for design and testing, begin production, and deploy the improved models in perhaps 2 years. Gunn's solution was to pull guns from wrecked fighters and install them in existing bombers, a process that took weeks and used parts that were already in theater. His solution saved thousands of Allied lives because it was implemented immediately instead of after committee meetings and engineering reviews. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated what happens when innovation is unleashed rather than constrained by bureaucracy. A convoy that should have delivered critical reinforcements to Japanese forces was annihilated with minimal Allied losses. The campaign for New Guinea, which could have dragged on for years with horrific casualties, was effectively decided in 3 days because someone had the courage to modify aircraft without waiting for permission. That lesson, the importance of field innovation, and the willingness to ignore regulations when regulations impede necessary action, that lesson has been learned and forgotten repeatedly throughout military history. After World War II, the United States military institutionalized the innovation process, creating formal research and development structures, procurement regulations, testing protocols. These structures produced remarkable weapons systems and gave the U.S. military technological advantages that persist to this day. They also created bureaucratic inertia that makes rapid innovation difficult. The modern equivalent of Pappy Gunn, a maintenance officer who wants to modify aircraft to address battlefield problems, would face a regulatory environment that makes unauthorized modifications nearly impossible. They'd need engineering approval, environmental impact studies, safety certifications, procurement justification, budget authorization, and congressional oversight before making changes that Gunn implemented with a wrench and a welder. This isn't necessarily bad. Modern aircraft are vastly more complex than a B-25 Mitchell. Modifications that seem straightforward can have cascading effects on systems that interact in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The regulatory structure exists for good reasons, primarily to prevent well-intentioned but dangerous modifications that could kill more Allied personnel than enemy forces. But something is lost when innovation can only flow through official channels. The ability to rapidly adapt to battlefield conditions, to implement solutions before the enemy adapts to your previous solutions. That ability is dulled by structures that prioritize control over speed. Papigans commerce destroyers worked because they were deployed immediately before Japanese naval forces could develop countermeasures. If those modifications had required 2 years of engineering review and testing, the Japanese would have adjusted their convoy tactics, added more anti-aircraft weapons, developed fighter escort procedures specifically designed to counter low-altitude strafers. The window of opportunity would have closed. The commerce destroyers remained effective throughout the Pacific War because they continued to evolve faster than Japanese defenses could adapt. Gunn and the mechanics he trained kept improving the designs, adding more guns, refining attack tactics, incorporating lessons learned from each mission. The B-25 strafer that attacked the Bismarck Sea convoy in March 1943 was significantly different from the B-25 strafer attacking Japanese shipping in the Philippines in 1945. Both were called B-25 seconds, but the later versions incorporated hundreds of small improvements that had emerged from combat experience. That iterative development process, refine, test, running on a cycle measured in weeks rather than years, gave Allied air forces a decisive advantage. Modern military forces attempt to preserve that advantage through rapid prototyping and agile development methodologies borrowed from software engineering. The results are mixed. Some programs successfully deliver innovative capabilities quickly. Others get bogged down in the same bureaucratic processes they were designed to circumvent. The fundamental tension remains. How do you maintain safety and accountability while preserving the ability to innovate rapidly? Papigun's answer was to ignore the tension entirely, to implement what needed to be implemented and let the bureaucracy sort itself out afterward. That approach worked during World War II because the stakes were existential. The alternative to rapid innovation was losing the war, and losing the war meant the bureaucracy wouldn't matter anymore because there wouldn't be a United States military to have bureaucratic procedures. That calculus is different in modern conflicts that don't threaten national survival. The pressure to innovate exists, but it's balanced against other pressures: budget constraints, political considerations, liability concerns, career risks for officers who approve unauthorized modifications. The result is that modern Papiguns, and they exist, frustrated mechanics and engineers who see obvious solutions to battlefield problems, often find themselves constrained by systems that prioritize process over results. Some work within the system, navigating bureaucracy to implement their innovations through official channels. Others work around the system, implementing field modifications that technically violate regulations but improve combat effectiveness. Both approaches have their successes and failures. What's lost is the middle ground that existed during World War II, where a general like George Kenney could simply authorize a mechanic to modify aircraft and deal with the paperwork later if ever. The human cost of that lost middle ground is difficult to quantify. How many lives would be saved by rapid implementation of battlefield innovations? How many lives would be lost to dangerous modifications that hadn't been properly tested? The answer depends on the specific innovation, the specific battlefield situation, and factors that can't be predicted in advance. What's certain is that Papigun's modifications at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea saved thousands of Allied lives by destroying Japanese reinforcements before they could engage Allied ground forces. Those modifications also enabled Allied air forces to interdict Japanese supply lines throughout the Southwest Pacific, starving enemy garrisons of the resources they needed to mount effective resistance. The campaign for New Guinea, which could have rivaled Guadalcanal for casualties and duration, was instead a series of relatively quick victories because the Japanese couldn't reinforce or resupply their positions. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's inability to defend its convoys forced them to abandon their outer defensive perimeter earlier than planned. Islands that should have been defended to the last man were instead evacuated or isolated and bypassed. The timetable for Allied offensives accelerated because Japanese resistance was weaker than expected. All of this flowed from the tactical reality that aircraft modified by a mechanic working in a field hangar could sink ships faster than those ships could be replaced. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea has been called the decisive aerial engagement of the Southwest Pacific Theater. That assessment is accurate, but it understates the case. The battle didn't just decide one campaign, it validated an entire approach to maritime interdiction that would be used for the rest of the war. Every subsequent Allied attack on Japanese shipping incorporated lessons learned from Bismarck Sea. The tactics refined by Gunn and the pilots of the 3rd Bomb Group became standard doctrine. By 1945, the Japanese could not move significant forces by sea anywhere within range of Allied air power. This meant they couldn't reinforce their garrisons in New Guinea, couldn't resupply their positions in the Philippines, couldn't effectively defend the islands they still controlled. American submarines and aircraft together created an interdiction network that strangled Japan's ability to wage war. The submarines got more attention in popular histories, but the aircraft, particularly the commerce destroyers developed by Pappy Gunn, did a significant portion of the work. The final irony is that Gunn's innovations, which violated regulations and official procurement procedures, became the basis for those official procedures in later conflicts. The modern doctrine for close air support, for interdiction of enemy logistics, for multi-role aircraft that can perform both bombing and strafing missions, all of it traces lineage back to a mechanic who pulled guns from wrecked fighters and bolted them onto bombers because that's what the situation required. Military planning documents now include provisions for rapid field modifications, for incorporating lessons learned from combat into procurement decisions, for allowing tactical units to adapt equipment to local conditions. These provisions exist because World War II demonstrated that armies which can't adapt quickly lose to armies that can. Pappy Gunn's legacy isn't just the specific modifications he made to A-22s and B-25s. His legacy is the principle that combat effectiveness matters more than regulatory compliance, that saving lives matters more than following procedures, that winning wars requires the courage to ignore rules written by people who aren't being shot at. That principle makes bureaucrats uncomfortable because it suggests their carefully constructed regulations might impede rather than enable military effectiveness. But it's a principle that remains true regardless of bureaucratic discomfort. Every conflict produces its Pappy Guns, mechanics and engineers, and junior officers who see problems and implement solutions without waiting for official approval. Some of them get court-martialed, some of them get medals, most of them get ignored by official histories that prefer to credit institutional processes rather than individual initiative. But the solutions persist, incorporated into later designs, adopted by later units, becoming standard practice without acknowledgement of their unofficial origins. The B-25 strafer that Gunn built in violation of regulations became the B-25J that rolled off North American Aviation's production line with official approval. The skip bombing tactics developed by crews in the Southwest Pacific became standard doctrine taught to new pilots. The commerce destroyer concept, aircraft optimized for anti-shipping attacks at low altitude, became the A-1 Sky Raider in Korea and Vietnam, and eventually the A-10 Thunderbolt in modern conflicts. Each generation of military aircraft incorporates lessons learned from previous generations, and buried in those lessons are the contributions of people like Paul Gunn who didn't wait for permission before solving problems. Their names aren't on the aircraft. Their contributions aren't mentioned in the manufacturer's specifications. But every time a modern attack aircraft makes a strafing run, every time a pilot suppresses ground defenses with forward-firing weapons before delivering ordnance, they're using tactics and techniques that trace back to a maintenance hangar in Australia in 1942, where a former airline pilot was installing machine guns in bomber nose sections because men were dying, and something had to be done. The official credit went elsewhere. The official history tells a different story. But the truth is that wars are won by people willing to break rules, and when those rules prevent victory. Pappy Gunn understood this instinctively. He didn't ask for permission because he knew permission would be denied or delayed until it was irrelevant. He modified aircraft, trained crews, refined tactics, and let the results speak for themselves. When those results included the destruction of an entire Japanese convoy with minimal Allied losses, when those results included saving thousands of Allied lives by preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the battlefield, the bureaucracy had no choice but to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the unauthorized modifications had been the right call. By the time official approval caught up with reality, gun had already moved on to the next problem, the next modification, the next innovation that regulations said couldn't be done, and battlefield necessity said had to be done. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.